Approaches to language in the classroom context. Interlanguage is a term that describes the language learner's journey from his native language L1 to acquisition of the target language L2. Larry Selinker, who is credited for the first proposing the interlanguage theory, was inspired by Corder's error analysis, which attempted to examine and classify the errors of language learners. Interlanguage theory tried to determine if there was a continuum in the internal grammar of learning additional languages, and through research resolved if learners acquired second language in much of the same fashion as L1. Ultimately, there would be similarities, but not the same. Interlanguage viewed language development as a combination of several factors, including nature of input, environment, internal processing of the learner, and influence between L1 and L2. Thus began an explosion of research into understanding how language and internal grammar in second language learners evolved. How interlanguage is formed. Savelt named interlanguage as transfer, meaning a transition of prior knowledge from L1 to L2 as one of the processes that involved in interlanguage development. Further, she identifies two types of transfer, positive transfer and negative transfer. Positive transfer occurs when an L1 structure or rule is used in an L2 utterance, and that use is appropriate or correct in the L2. Meanwhile, negative transfer occurs when an L1 structure or rule is used in an L2 utterance, and that use is inappropriate and considered an error. In this process of transfer, the aspects of language involved are vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, and all other aspects of language structure. There are 5 central processes that exist central to second language learning. First, language transfer. Second, transfer of training. Third, strategies of second language learning. Fourth, strategies of second language communication. And fifth, overgeneralization of TL linguistic materials. In the first process, language transfer, some of the rules in interlanguage system may be the result of transfer from the learner's first language. The learners use the mother tongue to create their own language system. And this is not an error, but the process that must be passed by the learners when they learn the second language. For example, today was really tired. In the second process, transfer of training, some of the components of the interlanguage system may be the result from transfer of a specific elements through which the learners are taught the second language. In the third process, strategies of second language learning, some of the rules in the learner's interlanguage may be the result from the application of language learning strategies as a tendency on the part of the learners to reduce the TL to a simpler system. In the next process, strategies of second language communication, interlanguage system rules may also be the result of strategies employed by the learners in their attempt to communicate with native speakers of the target language. As the last process, overgeneralization, some of the rules of the interlanguage system may be the result of overgeneralization of specific rules and features of the target language. For instance, the learners can say, I goed home, to overgeneralize English rules by adding ed at the end of the verb to express the past form. This error happened because of the learning strategies. What influenced interlanguage? Interlanguage has been widely influenced by several factors, such as social, discourse, psycholinguistics, and linguistics as offered by Rod Ellis. Social aspect of interlanguage. From the social angle, Ellis introduced 3 different approaches of interlanguage. Interlanguage involves a stylistic continuum that learners develop a capability of using the L2, which is based on a regular language behavior and produces an abstract linguistic system. In constructing their interlanguage, learners use their input influenced by social factors. To shape their opportunities to speak and to learn an L2, learners negotiate their social identities in their interactions with native speakers. The scores aspects of interlanguage. Through this aspect, Rod Ellis suggests the role of input and interaction and the role of output in L2 acquisition as follows. The role of input and interaction in L2 acquisition can be viewed from the perspective of some prominence. Behaviors views language learning determined from the environment. It is controlled from the outside through stimuli and reinforcement. Mentalists suggest the importance of the learner's black box. Learners are already equipped with brain ability to learn language and that they need minimal exposure to acquisition. Interactionists emphasize the importance of both input and internal language processing. Foreigner talk means the language that native speakers use to speak with no native speakers. There are 2 types, grammatical and ungrammatical. Various types of modifications to assist interlanguage development. Grammatical foreigner talk is delivered at a slow pace. The input is simplified. Grammatical foreigner talk is sometimes regularized. Foreigner talk sometimes consists of elaborate languages. The role of output in L2 acquisition, Swine argues that comprehensive output plays some important roles in language acquisition, such as it serves learners' consciousness and helps them to notice gaps in their interlanguages. It helps learners to test hypotheses that they can try some rules and see the feedback, positive or negative. It gives them chance to them to talk about their own output, identify some problems in it, and discuss solution to fix it. Phenomenon of fossilization. Interlanguage is the learner's current version of the language they are learning. Interlanguage changes all the time, but can become fossilized language when the learners do not have the opportunity to improve. For example, a learner who has lived in an English-speaking environment for many years, but not attended classes or studied for some time, has problems with the prior speech and forming tag questions. His interlanguage has become fossilized. In the classroom, interlanguage is often heavily influenced by L1, and interference from this make it seem perfectly logical to the learner, although it is incorrect. It is important for teachers to understand this and also to see interlanguage as a series of learning steps. Consciousness, noticing, and restructuring. One of the more controversial issues in applied linguistics concerns the role of conscious and unconscious processes in the second language learning. On the one hand, there are many who believe that conscious understanding of the target language system is necessary if learners are to produce correct forms and use them appropriately. In this view, errors are the result of not knowing the rules of the target language, forgetting them, or not paying attention. There is little theoretical support for the most traditional form of this view. No current theory posits the conscious study of grammar as either a necessary or enough condition for language learning. However, Bialstock has provided a theoretical framework that allows the role of conscious knowledge, and Rutherford and Sharwood Smith have argued that consciousness raising, drawing learners' attention to formal properties of language, facilitates language learning. Others firmly believe that language learning is essentially unconscious. Seeliger has claimed that obviously it is at the unconscious level that language learning takes place. Krashen has elaborated a theory that rests on a distinction between two independent processes: genuine learning, called acquisition, which is subconscious, and conscious learning, which is of little use in actual language production and comprehension. Gregg, one of Krashen's harshest critics who opposes Krashen's claim that learning can never become acquisition, agrees that most language learning is unconscious and asks, but then, does anybody disagree? A third commonly held position is that the issue of consciousness should be avoided altogether in a theory of language acquisition. McLaughlin, Rossman, and McLeod argue against Krashen's learning acquisition distinction because it rests on what they consider to be the unsupportable distinction between conscious and unconscious knowledge. In a recent discussion of explicit and implicit knowledge, Otlin recommends divorcing these concepts from the notoriously slippery notion of consciousness. Learning a second language is a complex and variable process. Unlike first language acquisition, second language acquisition is often marked by an interlanguage, consisting of fragmentary, incomplete knowledge to varying degrees in different linguistic domains. For example, morphosyntactics, phonology, and semantics, with only occasional piecemeal success as far as complete acquisition is concerned. Selinker was the first one in the field of second language acquisition to use the term fossilization to refer to such premature stabilization of L2 deviant forms. Since then, fossilization research has remained a cornerstone of the field, constantly shedding light and or fueling the advances in related subareas, such as L2 learnability and teachability. Hence, timely proposition of the selective fossilization hypothesis is yet another significant contribution to the field. It posits that the relative strength and interaction of the two parameters, namely L1 markedness and L2 input robustness, and their respective subvariables of frequency and variability, work in tandem to predict the fossilizability of a specific target L2 structures. It should be noted, however, that some fundamental assumptions have been made regarding certain critical notions and perspectives in second language acquisition in order for the SFH to materialize its predictive power. A case in point is its putative assumptions with regard to cognitive perspective of second language acquisition. At the core of this cognitive perspective is the role of consciousness in L2 learning. At first glance, it seems clear enough that consciousness only plays a minimal role as far as the fundamental assumptions of the SFH is concerned. After all, for the parameter of L1 markedness, cross-linguistic influence in the form of L1 morphosyntactic, phonologic, semantic transfer, and so on are largely unconscious. As for the parameter of L2 input robustness, the whole point of making L2 input robust, that is frequent and invariable, is to manipulate attention and by extension input processing, implicity, in order to facilitate the development of L2 implicit knowledge. That being the case, the notion of attention, or its subjective correlative of noticing, is not a monolithic concept. While Schmidt claims that the concept of attention is necessary for understanding the development of interlanguage over time and variation within interlanguage at particular points in time, it is apparent that the kind of attention he is referring to is awareness at a very low level. Specifically, Schmidt postulates three putative roles of consciousness and input processing in ultimately L2 learning. Conscious awareness at the level of noticing, little to subliminal learning. Consciousness in the form of paying attention, which results in incidental learning. Consciousness in the form of an unconscious process of abstraction, which contributes to implicit learning. According to him, subliminal language learning is not quite possible. The issues of incidental learning and implicit learning, however, still warrant for empirical learning. Thus, although attention alone may not be a sufficient condition for acquiring a target L2 structure, the role of detection or cognitive registration of linguistic stimuli, one of the subsystems of attention, in facilitating further processing and eventually L2 learning, still seems worth pursuing. In short, the fact that SFH does not take a learner's internal processing perspective in arriving at predictions about the fossilizability of target L2 structures by no means implies that the concept of attention has no bearing vis-a-vis L2 instruction and learning. Rather, attention is likely to be a key consideration to factor in as the L2 structure deals with target structures that fall within the fossilization zone. Indirect as the role of consciousness may appear in relation to the selective fossilization, there is no conscience on the role of consciousness in second language learning. It seems that the most common attitude towards consciousness is one of skepticism. The most influential arguments against any role of consciousness in behavior and learning were originally put forward by behaviorists, who were committed to elimination of the concept from psychological explanation. The basic behaviorist position is that the consciousness is epiphenomenal, playing no causal role in the human life. Behaviorists argued at other times that consciousness is a meaningless, pre-scientific term, a view expressed from some philosophers, and originated the objection that consciousness cannot be scientifically investigated because conscious experience is subjective, external observation is impossible, and introspection is discounted as being notoriously unreliable. Others have advanced the view that conscious states and processes are simply less significant and less interesting than unconscious phenomena. The views of Freud and Chomsky have been especially influential. Freud's most general claim that unconscious mental processes are complex and ubiquitous is widely accepted and is clearly supported by contemporary research in cognitive psychology. In the second language field, strongly influenced by Chomsky, it is virtually an article of faith that what is acquired is an implicit, that is, unconscious, mental grammar that is most clearly reflected in learners' intuitions about sentences, less directly in learner performance, and least directly in learners' conscious belief and statements about their use of language. Nevertheless, the time may be right for serious reconsideration of the phenomenon of consciousness and the role it may play in language learning. In psychology, the decline of behaviorism was associated with widespread recognition that consciousness is an important concept for the explanation of psychological phenomena, and consideration of the role of consciousness in cognition and learning has been respectable for the past 2 decades. The mainstream point in current cognitive psychology does not support the position that subjective awareness is epiphenomenal, and it is frequently claimed that learning without awareness is impossible. Research on the general nature of learning, including work on its relations to attention and awareness, constitutes an important source of information and ideas, a source that second language acquisition theory cannot afford to ignore. Second language acquisition theory must be concerned not only with learning in general, but also with the ways in which the nature of the learning is affected by the nature of the target. Accounts involving noticing have so far failed in this regard because they have largely ignored the issue of what language is. The result is that it is extremely difficult to determine exactly what claims they actually make about language learning. The hypothesis is further weakened by empirical work in second language acquisition, which not only fails to support but it possesses serious challenges.